Hey guys, my name is Austin Gregory, and in this course I'm going to teach you how to create a turn-based battle system for our RPG games. This course is going to be built on top of what we learned in the previous 101 course, and we're also going to learn some new things that's going to help us build this system out. So the first thing I want to do is create a new Unity project in the Unity Hub, and I'm going to call it Turn-Based Battling. And I'm going to use the latest version available to me, which is 2018.1.5. And it's going to be in 2D, and I do not need Unity Analytics enabled. So I'm going to tick that off and click Create Project. Alright, so to make sure that we're in the same layout, I'm going to go up to the top right and click Layout, and I'm going to go to Default. And we're going to start out just like this. We may make some changes throughout this course to better help us design our scenes. But for now, this works just fine. So a system like this is going to require a ton of parts working together. We're going to have characters and spells and attacks, and we're going to be able to heal each other, and we're going to be able to click on enemies and cast a spell on them. All kinds of cool stuff, and it all has to work in a turn-based manner. So it's going to say, all right, the player can go first, and this is the first person that can attack. And then once you attack with that person, then it's the next person's turn. And then after all the players have attacked, it goes over to the enemy side and they do the same thing. But that's controlled by the computer, so it's completely automated. Then it goes back to the player. And a lot of stuff has to work together to make this work. So we're going to have to break it down into the simplest forms first, and then we'll expand from there to get the system that we need. So in order to get something started, we're going to start creating these spells. It's going to be the major part of our battling system. Spells are going to really change the dynamic of the battle. So I want to design these so we can actually create different types of spells very easily and assign them to our players or our characters very, very simply. So to do that, I'm going to first create a folder inside my assets folder, and I'm going to call it spells. Our spells are going to be prefabricated objects, so just prefabs that have all the properties set for whatever spell it should be. So if we have a fireball spell, it's going to have, say, 5 damage. It's going to cost, we'll say, 10 mana. And we'll have some particle effects that give it a fiery look. And whenever we cast that spell, it'll go from whoever cast the spell to whoever the target is, and it will fly across the screen and catch them on fire and deal damage. So we're going to start with the spells, and then we'll go from there and start building up our character. So now I want to create another folder for our scripts. This is going to hold all the scripts that controls everything in our game. So let's jump into scripts now, and I want to create a new C# script, and I want to call it spell. So all of our spells are going to use this simple C# script file. And while we're in here, I'm going to create an empty object. I'm going to right click inside my hierarchy, and I'm going to create empty. And we're going to first create a fireball. So I'm going to call this fireball, and I'm going to drag spell and drop it on that as a component on my fireball object. Now there's nothing inside my spell script file just yet, but this fireball is a spell, even though spell is currently nothing. And what I want to do is I want to take fireball, and I'm going to drag it into my spells folder and create a prefabricated object that is set up as a fireball with a spell component on it. And now back in my scripts folder, I want to edit the spell script to actually do some stuff, right? So fireball will actually have the components that make up a spell. So open this up in Visual Studio. And for now, I'm going to get rid of both of the starting methods here. So let's think about this. What does a spell need? A spell is going to have a name. We want something to display in the UI. So whenever we select our character and we say, okay, I want to cast a spell, we're going to have a list of spells that are assigned to that character, and we're going to be able to tell what they are based on the name. So we want a name for our spells. So I'm going to create a public string, and I'm going to call it spell name. Easy enough. And now I also want to be able to decide how much power this spell has. So how much damage or how much healing can this spell do? So I'll create a public integer, and I will call it power. And I also want to decide how much mana this spell will cost to cast. So I'll create another public integer, and I will call it mana cost. And the last property I want a spell to be able to have will be the type of spell it is. So if we have a damage spell, it'll be an attack spell. If we have a healing spell, it'll be a heal spell. And I want to be able to decide that whenever we are designing our spell. So if we look in our fireball here, after that compiles, we'll see I can decide the spell name, the spell power, and the mana cost, and that will assign those values to my prefab object, so it'll all be packaged up into one object just like this. But I also want to be able to decide, based on a couple of values, what type of spell it is. So to do that, we'll create something called an enum. So I'll create a public enum, and I want to call it spell type. Notice this is capitalized at the start here, as we're creating a new type of object, and not just creating an object. So it's going to be a spell type, and I'm going to use my curly braces here to give it a couple of values. Now these values I'm going to give it are going to be the options I can choose from in this property in the inspector, which is pretty much all we need to care about for now. So I'm going to say attack, and then heal. Notice no quotation marks, just a comma in between. But that is just defining the enum itself. That's defining the type itself. I now want to create a variable that will hold that type, whatever we decide it may be. So I'll create a public spell type. Notice we just used the enum that we created as the type for this variable. And I will call it spell type lowercase s. Now if I look in the inspector, I have spell type with a drop-down menu that gives me my two options. So all I've done is I've created a type that is restricted to two values. I could add more out here if I wanted different types of spells, but in my case, I do not. So for Fireball, I will call it Fireball. The power will be 5, and the mana cost will say 5, and it will be a type of attack. Now the reason the spell type is important is because if we have a heal spell, I want to make sure it increases the health value instead of decreases the health value. And this is going to be how we decide what to do whenever we use the spell. Do we damage the character or do we heal the character? Now, whenever a spell is instantiated, whenever it is created in our world, it needs to have a target position. It needs to have a direction to go, right? We're going to cast it and it's going to move towards something. So to do that, I'm going to have a private variable here that's going to allow me to store a reference position. So it's going to be, we'll say the player is casting a spell towards an enemy. This will be that enemy's position, so to move from the player to the enemy. So I have a vector3, which is again an x, y, and z coordinate, and I'm going to call it target position. And now let's get to the actual functionality of our spell. We have all the data set up now, so let's actually make it function. The first thing I want to do is I want to create the method we're going to use whenever we cast a spell. It's going to be a public void. I'm going to call it cast. So we're going to be able to go through the spell, and then we're going to be able to call cast, just like that. Now, cast is going to require a target character, so we don't have that ability right now. We don't have a character defined, so we'll get back to that in a bit. Remember, I mentioned there's a lot of parts that have to work together for this, so we're going to be able to define everything in the simplest form we can, and then from there we'll build out. But for now, I'll just fill this in with game object, and I will call it character. Here in a bit, this will be a character type and not a game object, but this will work for now. Actually, I'll call it target and not character. Makes more sense. So I want the target position of this spell whenever we cast to be set to target.transform.position. So whatever the position of that character is will be the target position of this spell. So whenever we cast whenever we call the method cast, we'll pass in that character information, then we'll grab that character's position, which is now the target of this spell. And for now, it's all cast needs. Here in a bit, we'll set up the hurt or the healing depending on what type of spell it is. But for now, it's all we have. And I also want to do an update. So we're going to have an update that's going to fire off every single frame. We're going to lerp the position, or we're going to move the position of the spell from A to B. So from the starting position to the target position. So I'll have a void update. And again, this is every single frame. So if target position is not equal to vector3.0, we could also make sure that it's not nulled out. Make sure it's actually, it exists. But 0 is going to be fine. The chance of it being 0 is, in this case, 0 because it's going to be wherever our characters are in the battle scene. And in this case, we're not going to have any characters at 0, 0, 0. So if it is 0, that means it's never been assigned to. So we don't need to do anything with it. Nothing has changed. So if we have a target position, all I want to do is move my spell towards that target position a bit every single frame. So every single frame will get a bit closer to the target position. So I'll say transform.position, which is referring to the spell's position, is equal to, and we're going to use a method on vector3 called move towards. Now this allows me to define the current position, the target position, and then the amount that we move each frame towards that position. So in this case, it's pretty much going to be the speed at which we move each frame towards that position. So the current position is transform.position, and the target position, as you know, is target position. And I'll move, we'll say 0.15 float every single frame. So we're going to move about 15% of the way there every single tick that we hit this transform.position. And that'll work fine, but I also want to do something when I get to that position that we're trying to get to. Once we get there, after a bit of time, I just want to kill the spell. I want to destroy the spell so it goes away. We don't want it to be there forever. Once we reach our target, give it, I don't know, almost a second maybe, and then we'll destroy the spell. So I'm going to say if, and again, we're going to go through vector3, and we're going to use a different method here. It's going to tell us the distance between 2 points. So we have vector3a, then we have vector3b, and it will give us the distance between those two positions. So we can say if it is less than, a unit or a quarter of a unit, then we're close enough to say, okay, we'll start that destroy countdown. The reason we're not saying if we're not exactly at that position, because we don't know it with a floating point error. So after, 0.555555555, we don't know if we're going to be exactly on that given how floating point errors can work. So I'm just going to give it a range and say, if we're this close, then that's close enough. So I'm going to say distance, and we need a vector A and a vector B to compare. So I'm going to say A is the transform.position, and B is the target position. So the distance between these, we're going to check this every single frame. It'll only be close enough once we get close enough, so it's not going to matter. I want to say if that is less than, we'll say 0.25f, so a quarter of a unit. Then we're close enough to start the destroy countdown. So I'm going to say destroy, which is a built-in method that allows us to destroy a game object, but we can also pass in a time parameter that will say, okay, after this amount of time, destroy it. I want to destroy the game object referring to this game object, which is redundant, but we can see what it means if we define that there. It makes it a bit more clear. And the time I want to wait to destroy it once we reach that point, we could say 1 second, or we can say half a second. I'll say 1 second for now. See how that looks. And that's all we need to actually move the spell towards the target. Now, what if for some reason we had a spell that was created, but it doesn't have a target position? And I'm not sure how this could happen, but we never know. We want to make sure we cover all cases just to make sure we don't have any silly errors or silly bugs. So I want to say if this is in fact equal to 0, so we don't have a target position, I want to then just destroy the object, make sure we don't have it on the game scene. We don't need that there, so I'll say else. And then I'll just take this again here, destroy game object, but I'll destroy it immediately, so no time given, because if it does exist, it shouldn't unless it has a target. So I'll go ahead and destroy it, just to make sure we don't get any weird errors. And last but not least, for now, what I want to do is I want to set up the checks to see what kind of spell this is. We can't actually do anything with it yet until we have a character, but I want to fill it out the most I can until then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if I want to go through spell type, the lowercase, the actual variable, and I want to say if spell type is equal to, now this is where it gets cool. I can go through the spell type enum now, and it will give me the types of spells it can be. So I'll say if it is equal to attack. So if there's an attack spell, then I'll do one thing, else, and I could say else if, or I could just say else. It could only be one other thing, but to keep it clean and understandable, I'll say if again here. Then I'll say spell type again, the variable, is equal to spell type dot heal. So we would come in here and we would do what we want to do if it is an attack spell or if it is a heal spell, and heal spell. And just to make sure we have something that we can look at later on, I'm going to log out a message to the console that'll tell me what happened, who cast a spell, or who's the spell going towards, in fact. So I want to say spell name was cast on And then again, just concatenate here, target dot name. And we'll have character name here in a bit, but for now we'll just use name and just throw in an exclamation at the end there. And here we're going to hurt the character. And here we're going to heal. So back in Unity, what I want to do now, for the last thing we want to do for our fireball, we'll also create a couple other spells in the future, but for now we're just going to focus on the fireball. I want to add some particle effects so we can actually see what's happening. We don't have any graphics or anything to show off the spells, so we're just going to create some simple particles, very, very basic stuff, but just to give it a little flair, literally for the fireball. So I want to click on this, on Add Component, and I want to go to Particle System. I'm adding this directly to my fireball. Now, that doesn't look very fiery, and I can't guarantee that what I'm going to design is going to look fiery either, but we're going to look a bit better than that. So I'm going to give it a bit of a orange starting color there, and I want the start speed to be, that's about fine, just like that. We'll leave all that for now. On emission, what I want to do is maybe speed it up to about 15 per second. On the shape, I don't want a cone. Working in 2D space here, what I want to do is maybe create a circle, or we can actually use an edge for this to give it a bit of momentum upwards very simply in 2D space. And I want to come down and go to renderer, and it's going to allow me to decide what the material that I'm using is. And what I want to do with this is I want to go and import some of my graphics. If I go back to my desktop here, I have a basic particle graphic I created and also an arrow particle I created that's going to be the Ranger's effect, just to show you a different type of effect. I'm going to take both of these, drag them in, and for now I'll just drop it into my assets folder. And then inside of spells, I'm going to create a material folder that's going to house our particle materials. So I'm going to take assets, basic particle, drag that into material, as well as arrow particle. And I'm going to right click, I'm going to create a new material object. This is going to be the material that our particles are going to use. So I'm going to call this one fire. And what I want to do is I want to go up to shader. I'm going to change the type of shader from standard down to particles, and I'll go to additive. This allows me to define a simple texture that I'm going to set as the basic particle. And I want to give it that cool fiery color, whatever that may be, something like that. And now back on Fireball, you'll notice if I go down to renderer, I can select the material for my renderer, and I can set it as the fire that I just created. Pretty cool. And in fact, to give it a bit more of a fiery look, I'm going to go back to Particles and go to Additive Soft. That looks pretty cool. Now back on Fireball, look in the game view here. What I want to do is I want to change the size over time. So we're going to start off at about 0.75, and then we're going to get smaller over time, so it's going to kind of fade away. So we're going to go down to size over lifetime, check that on, and notice it's growing bigger as time goes on here, which is kind of cool, but I want to reverse that. So I want to select the curve here in size, and I have some predefined curves down here. What I want to do is get smaller over time. Pretty cool. Maybe start off a bit larger. And we'll make the lifetime a bit shorter, about 1 second. The rate over time a bit more, maybe about 0.5 on the size. That's kind of fiery, kind of cool. And now we have our fireball. And while we're in here, I'm going to go back to my spells. I'm going to duplicate Fireball by hitting Control D on it. And I'm going to call it, we'll call it Arrow Rain. It's going to be our cool Ranger attack, Arrow Rain. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to my Fireball here. And notice the prefab does not have it on as a component, the particle effect. So what I want to do is I want to click Apply, which is going to apply the changes I made to my object in the hierarchy to my prefab object. So I'm going to click Apply. And now Fireball has it. Arrow Rain does not, so I'm going to delete that again here and duplicate it as it is. Now Arrow Rain has a particle effect. Arrow Rain. And now Arrow Rain, if I drag this out, we don't want it to look fiery. That's kind of silly for an arrow. So I'm going to make this a green color. And I'm going to change the material. So I want to use the same material that we just created. I'm going to duplicate that, and I want to call it arrow rain. And I'm going to change the material to the arrows. Now back on arrow rain, I'm going to go down to render once again, change this from fire to arrow, just to give you an example of the different effects you can make very easily with the built-in particle system. So I want to set the emission rate down to about 10, a bit slower perhaps. Take the shape, and I want to make this just 0.01, as small as we can get it. And I want to make the speed something a bit slower. And I also want to take the size over lifetime, and we could do something different with this as well. Make it grow kind of like that. The rate over time down to 2, and the lifetime to about 2 seconds. Bump the speed up a bit. Maybe, in fact, I'll take this point, drag it over, and then take this, add a key at the end here, and then drag this down. So we'll get a kind of growing and then shrinking motion. Which is pretty cool. Rate over time, back up a bit maybe. Whatever you want to do. That's a little strange, but it's fine. And again, we'll create an air blast spell here. So I'm going to just call this one air blast. Make it white as a start color. Renderer is going to use the fire effect again. And just make it move slower. Pretty cool. Now let's go through these and apply our changes. And I also want to go to fireball, or sorry, go to arrow rain. I'm going to call it arrow rain. It's an attack, air blast. We'll call it air blast. And that's fine. So there we go. Now we have our spell set up. We have most of the spell functionality in already. That's a great start. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at creating our characters. That's going to allow us to expand the spell system a bit, as well as start using it in our character objects. So that's going to be it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to start our character object. It's going to allow us to finish up our spell object and also expand it with our characters. So that's going to be the next lesson, guys. My name is Austin, and I will see you there.